Chapter 11 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The work went on, for Cadnan as well as for the masters. Days passed, and he began to improve slightly. He received no further discipline, and he was beginning to settle into a routine. Only thoughts of Dara disturbed him. Those, and the presence of Marver, who was still apparently waiting to make good his incomprehensible threat. Marver had said he was going to leave, but he still appeared every evening in the same room. Cadnan had hardly dared to question him, for fear of being drawn into the plan, whatever it was. He could only wait and watch and wish for someone to talk to. But of course there was no one. And then one day, during the first part of his working shift, a master came into the room. The very master who had gone with Cadnan through his training. "You're Cadnan?" he asked. Cadnan said, "I am Cadnan." The master beckoned through the open door of Cadnan's working room, and two more masters appeared, strange ones, leading between them an elder. The elder, Cadnan saw at once, had lived through many matings. The green skin of his arms was turning to silver, and his eye was no longer bright, but dulling fast with age. He looked at the working room and at the young Albert with blank caution. "This one is called Gornum," the master said. "He'll be with you when you work. He's going to help you work. You can teach him all he has to know. Just make sure you don't let him handle the buttons until we give you the word. All right?" Cadnan understood. "All right," he said, and the three masters left the room without more words. The door shut behind them, and Gornum visibly relaxed. Yet there was still wariness behind the old eye. "I work in the field," he said after a second. "I am good worker in the field." Cadnan knew from gossip about the field. That was the place where the metal lay. Alberts worked there, digging it up and bringing it to the buildings where Cadnan and many like him took over the job. He nodded slowly, bending his body from the waist instead of from the neck like the masters, or Marver. "If you are in the field," he said, "why do you come here? This is not a place for diggers." "I am brought here," Gornum said. "I am an elder many times. What the masters say, I do. Now they say I come here, and I come." Cadnan looked doubtful. "You want to work with me?" "So the masters say." That was unanswerable, and Cadnan accepted it. He flicked a glance at the TV screen, which showed him the smelting process, and leaped for the buttons. After a few minutes of action, he was finished. There was a slight breathing space. "I am to tell you what to do," he said. Gornum looked grave. "I see what it is you do," he said. "It is a lesson. When you act for the masters, the great machines obey you." "It is true," Cadnan said. "This is the lesson," Gornum said slowly, as if it were truly important. "We are shown the machines so that we may learn to be like the machines. When the master tells us what to do, we are to do it. There is nothing else." Cadnan thought about that. It made sense. It made a structure he could understand, and it made the world a less confusing place. "You have said a truth," he judged at last. "It is one of many truths," Gornum said. And that was an invitation, Cadnan recognized. He hesitated no more than a second. "Where may I learn the others?" But Gornum didn't answer, and Cadnan's breathing space was over. He had to be back at the board, pushing buttons, watching carefully. Gornum stood behind him, peering over his shoulder with a cloudy eye. Neither said a word until the new spell of work was over. Then Cadnan repeated his question. "It is not for all," Gornum said distantly. "One must be chosen." "You have come to me," Cadnan said. "You have been sent to me. Is this what you call chosen?" It was the right answer. Perhaps the only right answer. Gornum pretended to consider the matter for a minute, but his mind was already made up.
"We are above you, on the floor over yours," he said. "When our work is finished, I will take you there."
Cadnan imagined a parade of new truths, a store of knowledge that would lay all his questions to rest and leave him, as after a meal, entirely satisfied. He went back to work and contemplated the first of the truths. He was to be like the machine. He promised himself he would try to imitate the machine, doing only what the masters ordered. And for the rest of that day, indeed, life seemed to make perfect calming sense. But after all, Gornum was only an elder, and not a master. He could be wrong. The doubt appeared at the end of the day, but by then Gornum had the younger Albert in tow. They took the elevator up one flight and went to Gornum's room. The novelty of all this excited Cadnan so that he nearly forgot his new doubts. They shrank perceptibly without disappearing altogether. Gornum opened the door of the new room. Inside, Cadnan saw 6 elders sitting in a circle on the floor. The circle, incomplete, was open toward the door, and all 6 big eyes were staring at the newcomers. The floor was nearly bare. The leaves had been brushed into mounds that lay in the corners. Without a word, Gornum sat in the circle and motioned Cadnan to a place beside him. Moving slowly and uncertainly, Cadnan came forward and sat down. There was a second of absolute silence. One of the other elders said,
"You bring a new one to us?"
"I bring a new one," Gornum said. The other elder, leaning forward from the waist, peered at Cadnan. His eye was larger than normal, and glittering cold. Cadnan, awestruck, neither spoke nor moved, and the elder regarded him for a time, and then said abruptly,
"Not all are called to the truth." "He has been called," Gornum said. "He has been chosen." "How is he chosen?"
Gornum explained. When he had finished, a silence thick as velvet descended upon the room. Then, very suddenly, all the elders spoke at once.
"May the masters live forever."
Cadnan, by this time, was nearly paralyzed with fright. He sat very still. The elders continued, in a slow, leaden chorus.
"May the masters live forever. May the words live forever. May the lessons live forever. May the truths live forever."
Then the velvet silence came down again, but the words rang through it faintly until Gornum broke the spell with speech.
"The young one has come to learn. He has come to know the truths."
He looked around at the others and then went on.
"His name is Cadnan. He wishes to have your names. Let him have your names."
The elder who had spoken first identified himself as Lonak. The others gave their names in order: Dalor, Puna, Grudak, Burlog, Mantoon. Cadnan stared with fascinated eyes at Puna, who was older than anyone he had ever seen. His skin was nearly all white, and in the dim room it seemed to have a faint shine. His voice was very high and thin, like a wind sighing in tall tree branches. Cadnan shivered, but didn't take his eye from Puna, until, as if at a signal, all the elders rose. Awkwardly then, Cadnan rose with them, again confused, and still frightened. He saw Gornum raise his hands over his head and chant,
"Tall are the masters."
All the others repeated the words.
"Wise are the masters."
Cadnan this time repeated the phrase with the elders.
"Good are the masters."
When the antiphon had been delivered, Gornum waited a full second and then fell prostrate to the floor. The others followed his example, except for Cadnan, who, afraid to let himself fall on bare metal, crouched down slowly instead.
"Weak are the slaves,"
Gornum whispered. The answer was a whisper too.
"Small are the slaves,"
the others whispered.
They are like small ones all the days of their lives, and only the masters are elders. The masters are elders. As the machine obeys, Gornum said, so the slave obeys. As the tree obeys, so the slave obeys. As the metal obeys, so the slave obeys. As the ground obeys, so the slave obeys. So the slave obeys.
Then there was silence again, not as profound as before. Through it, Cadnan could hear the others whispering, but he couldn't quite catch their words. He was later told what praying was, though he never had a chance to practice it. And then everyone returned to the original circle and squatted. In what was almost a normal tone, Gornum said,
Here is our new one. He must be told.
Puna himself rose.
I will tell him.
And Cadnan, frightened by the very look of the elder, could do nothing but follow him as he beckoned, and went to a corner near a mound of leaves. The others, scattered, were eating. Cadnan picked up a leaf, but Puna took it gently out of his hand.
We do not eat until it is over, he said quietly.
Cadnan accepted this without words, and Puna told him the legend. During the entire tale, Cadnan, stock still, didn't even think of interrupting. At first, his attention wandered to the leaves, but as Puna's voice went on, he listened more and more closely, and even his fright began to leave him under the legend's fascination.
Long ago, the masters come to the world, sent by the great elder. We are no more than children. We do not work. We do nothing except eat and sleep and live out our lives in the world. The great elder makes us the gift of talking and the gift of trees, and he makes the rules of the trees. Then he does nothing more for us. First, we must become more than children, more than small ones. For this, he sends the masters. The masters are good because they show us work and give us machines that have power. Our power is over the masters because of the machines, but we may not use such power. They are elder to us. They are wiser than we are. Only when we become so wise, we use power against them, and in that day, master and slave are one. In that day, the great elder returns to his small ones. In this time, there is the work, and the work makes us always more like the masters. We live in the buildings like masters. We work with machines like masters. We do what the masters say. Soon we are all the same. No one can tell when we are like masters in all things. We know of it when the great elder returns to us. All must watch and wait for that day. In this time, we only remember and tell ourselves the truths over and over. There are many truths, and some I cannot speak. Here are the others. The masters are our elders. The machines are under obedience to us while we obey the masters. The great elder wishes our obedience to the masters. If we disobey the masters, the machines and the trees will not obey us, and there will be no more work, and no small ones. For this is the order of the world, some obeying and some to be obeyed. It is visible and plain. When the chain is broken, all the chain breaks.
Puna paused and then repeated the last sentence.
When the chain is broken, all the chain breaks. It is true,
Cadnan said excitedly.
It is true. Yet there is more truth. There is,
Puna said soberly.
We meet again in 5 days' time. I can count 5 days, and so the others will know, and you will know. At this next meeting, you will be told more truths."
His smile was thin and distant.
"Now eat."
Cadnan reached numbly for a leaf and, without thinking, began to nibble. The world had been set in order. He had no more questions now. Instead, he felt empty spaces, waiting to be filled with the great knowledge of Puna and of Gornum and all the others at the next meeting. And at other meetings after that. He put that thought away. It was too much and too large. The one certain thing was that in 5 days' time, whenever that was, he would know more. In 5 days, they would all meet again. He hoped 5 days was not that long. As matters turned out, of course, he need not have worried. The meeting he was waiting for never happened. And after that, there were no more meetings at all. Public Opinion 3. Being excerpts from memo directives sent between executives of Associated Metallic Products Limited, a corporation having its main offices within Dome 2, Luna City, Luna, and associated offices on all 3 inhabited planets. The memo directives being dated between May 14th and May 21st, in the year of the Confederation 210. To John Harrison, from Frederick Ramsbotham. Metals, Supplies, and Shipment. It having come to my attention that the process of metal shipment is in danger because of the threat to the materials and procurement divisions of AMP Limited, I wish to advise you, as current chairman of the board, of the nature of the emergency, and request your aid in drawing up plans to deal with it. According to reports from our outside operatives, and such statistical checking as we have been able to use in a matter of this nature, there exists a strong possibility that present procurement procedures regarding our raw materials may at any moment be abrogated by act of the Confederation government. The original motive for this action would seem to be a rising tide of public unrest, sparked apparently by chance disclosure of our procurement procedures. That the public unrest may very soon reach the point at which Confederation notice, and hence Confederation action, may be taken, is the best judgment both of our outside operatives and of our statistical department. In order to deal with this unprecedented emergency, it would be advisable to have your thoughts on the matter. With these in hand, to Fred Ramsbotham, from John Harrison. Your memo, May 14th. My God, Fred, I haven't seen such a collection of verbiage since Latin class. Why not say what you mean? People are calling the setup on Freuling's world slavery, and slavery is a nasty word. Let's get together for a talk. And what's with the high-sounding guff? You sound sore about something. What? To James Oliver Gogarty, from Leonard Offutt. Statistical findings. The situation is serious, J.O., and there's no getting around it. If the government has to take action, there's only one way, given current majorities, they're going to be able to move, and that's to declare Freuling's world a protectorate or some such. Get your lawyers to straighten out the terminology. In plain and simple English, a ward of the state. And administer the place for the best interests of the natives. Get that, the natives. Never mind us. Never mind AMP. Never mind the metals we need. No, the government will step in and take all that away from us in the interests of a bunch of silly, green-looking monsters who can barely talk and can't, as near as I can see, think at all. Statistics don't give us much of a chance of heading them off. As a matter of fact, any recommended course of action has better than a 50% chance of making matters even worse. And if you don't think they can be worse, take a look at the attached sheet, which... To John Harrison, from Frederick Ramsbotham. Re. Your memo, May 15th. Have you never heard of the Confederation impounding records? Or those memos, for instance? To Fred Ramsbotham, from John Harrison. Re. Your memo, May 15th. Have you never heard of AMP burning them? You silly damn fool. Now let's get together for a talk. To James Oliver Gogarty, from Gregory Whiting and staff. Re. Your memo, May 17th. Pressure put on Confederation executives and members of the Senate might convince the Confederation that, without a fight, Freiling's world would not surrender to Confederation control. It might not be advisable to begin such a fight. Even with modern methods of transport and training, the weapons gap between the Confederation and Freiling's world is a severe handicap. In other words, J.O., if it came to a showdown, the people here don't think we stand a fair chance of coming out on top. You'd better rethink your position, then. To James Oliver Gogarty, from John Harrison. Re. Freiling's World. Interoffice Guff says you're planning definite moves on your own, J.O., and against some opposition. I'm still chairman of the board around here, and I intend to use power if I have to. The best advice I can get tells me your plans are unadvisable. Get it through your head that this has nothing to do with the board elections. This is a serious matter. I can stop you, J.O., and don't think I won't if it comes to that, but I don't want to make threats. There must be something we can do, but we're going to have to devote more thought to the whole matter first. To James Oliver Gogarty, from Leonard Offutt. Re. Statistical findings. Chances of such pressure succeeding are, according to derived figures, 37%. Chances of the pressure leading to actual attack on Freiling's world, see attached sheet, are 58%. We cannot advise. To Frederick Ramsbotham, from James Oliver Gogarty. Re. Attached statistical findings. Of course it's a risk, Frederick, but we're in the risk-taking business, and we always were, as your father used to say, and mine too. Between us, John is a cautious old man, and the rest of the board is beginning to appreciate that. By next year, the entire situation may have changed. I'm asking for your support then, as a matter of practical politics. In a risky matter like this one, support can make all the difference between. To James Oliver Gogarty, from John Harrison. Re. My memo, May 19th. J.O., I mean it. Now lay off. To Williston Reed, from John Harrison. Re. Current Memo Series. As you know, I'm keeping you up to date whenever I have a minute between appointments. A publicity chief ought to know everything, inside as well as public issue material, if only so he can be conscious of what to hide. I've tried to work with you as well as I can, and if there are delays in reporting, you'll understand that pressure of other duties. The story behind all of this is simple enough. The takeover Gogarty and Ramsbotham have been trying to pull is interfering with practical business. Frankly, AMP's competitors are happy enough to jump in and stir the pot. I think they've been buying up senators here and there, for which there is, God knows, enough precedent. The entire Senate hasn't been bought since the Dedrick Mutiny 40 years back, but you don't need the entire Senate if you have a few key men, and I've always thought Dedrick's lawyers were wasteful. And beyond what the competition's been active in, there are always the fanatics. Freedom for all, you know the sort of thing. Now, the big danger is that if R and G succeed in keeping things messed up, The rest of the Metals boys will step in, push the government into the right moves, and kill Froiling's world deader than Dedrick himself. Which, according to the statistical breakdown, won't put us into the bankruptcy courts, but will slide us from a first or second spot to a ninth or 10th one. The big question is whether you'd rather be a small frog in a big puddle or the reverse. Me, I'd rather be a big frog in a big puddle than any other combination I can think of. And in spite of everything, I think I'm going to go on being just that. Froiling's world has been around for a long time, but the current AMP fight gives the competition the opportunity they need, and they're pushing it. If we can weather the storm, well, I'm being gloomy. Of course we can weather the storm. I'll swing Gogarty back, and that will leave Ramsbotham nowhere to go. To John Harrison, from Frederick Ramsbotham, re Froiling's World. Support of the suggestion put forward by Mr. Gogarty at the last board meeting was not, believe me, given without grave consideration. Now that the matter has been decided, I hope we can all pull together like teammates and let the dead past bury its dead. I'm sure that... To Fred Ramsbotham, from John Harrison, re your memo, May 21st. I'm worrying a little more about burying some of the currently living, our own men on Froiling's World. I've got to ask you to reconsider. 2. All news services for immediate release. From Williston Reed. As almost his first act on taking his position as chairman of the board of Associated Metallic Products Limited, Frederick Ramsbotham today issued a statement of policy regarding interference by Confederation governmental officials in what he termed the private business of AMP. Mr. Ramsbotham, whose recent election came as a surprise to many shareholders, has stated his intention of remaining firm in continuance of present policies, regardless of what he described as threats from Confederation officials. He states that his duty to shareholders of AMP must include protection of the private and profit-making enterprise being carried on at Froiling's World, and that such private concerns are not the business of public government. As former chairman of the board, John Harrison was asked to comment on the position taken by Mr. Ramsbotham. Mr. Harrison stated that he disagreed with the particular stand taken by Mr. Ramsbotham in this matter, but sympathized with his strong feelings of duty towards the shareholders of the concern. Confederation response was reported to be immediate and strong by sources high in the government, but as yet no final word has been received regarding what action, if any, is contemplated. To Frederick Ramsbotham, from John Harrison. Subject, the daily paper. Now you've torn it, unless you think we can make money selling weapons to be used against our own people on Froiling's World. I've sold out my shares as of this morning, Fred. I'm through. I think you are too, whether you know it or not just yet. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Slave Planet by Laurence and Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. That old-time religion. Dodd heard the words echoing in his mind that night, and the next night, and the next. All that she had said. We set up a nice pie in the sky sort of thing, all according to the best theory. Just a thing to keep the Alberts happy and satisfied, and working hard for us. It started right after the first setup here. And by now, I guess the Alberts think they invented it all by themselves. Or their great elder came down from a tree and told them. It's horrible, he had said. Of course it is. There was a silence. But you said it yourself. What can we do? We're here, and we're stuck here. But Norma didn't want to argue. But the argument went on, in Dodd's mind. And it still continued, circling in his mind like a buzzard. There was nothing he could do about it. Nothing Norma could do about it. He avoided even the thought of seeing her for a few days. And then he found himself making an excuse to go over to Building 1. He met her there after lounging about for hours. And what she had disclosed to him, what they spoke of, made no difference that he could see in what he felt. He was happy. Slowly he realized that he had hardly ever been happy before. He even forgot, for a time, about the rumors, the threat of Confederation troops that had hung over her words like a gray cloud. All he could think of was Norma and the terrible thing in which they were both bound up. He told himself grimly that it would never have bothered Albin, for instance. Albin would have had his fun with Norma, and that would have been that. But it bothered Johnny Dodd. He was still worrying over it, and in spite of himself, finding happiness, when the escape came, and the end. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. There's nothing to be done about it. Dr. Hanlingen delivered the words and sat down rigidly behind her desk. Norma nodded very slowly. I know that, she said. I started to do just what you wanted. To talk to him, draw him out, find out just what he did feel and what he planned. And then something happened, Dr. Hanlingen said tightly. I know. Norma paced to the window and looked out, but the day was gray. She saw only her own reflection. Something happened, she murmured. I guess I had too much to drink. I wanted to talk. So I understand, Dr. Hanlingen said. And you talked. And whatever his situation, you managed to increase his tension rather than understand or lessen it. Norma shook her head at the reflection. I'm sorry. I have often found, Dr. Hanlingen said, that sorrow following an action is worse than useless. It usually implies a request to commit the same action again. But I wouldn't, Norma said, turning, and then stopped before the calm gaze of the old woman. No, Dr. Hanlingen said. I'll try to... Dr. Hanlingen lifted a hand and brushed the words aside. It doesn't matter, she said. I am beginning to see that it doesn't matter. But all we can do now is wait, Dr. Hanlingen said. We are outplayed. There was a little silence. Norma waded through it without moving. Would you like to have a lesson in psychology? Dr. Hanlingen said in the graying room. Would you like to learn a little, just a little, about your fellow man? Norma felt suddenly frightened. What's wrong? Nothing is wrong, Dr. Hanlingen said. Everything is moving along exactly as it might have been predicted. If we had known what the Confederation planned and exactly the timetable of their actions, but we did not and could not. Norma, listen to me. The story she told was very simple. It took a fairly long time to tell. Slavery takes a toll of the slaves, as the Confederation was beginning to find out, as the idealists, the do-gooders, were beginning, however slowly, to realize. But it takes a toll of the masters, too. The masters can't quite rid themselves of the idea that beings which react so much like people may really, in spite of everything, in spite of appearance, in spite of laws and regulations and social practices, be people after all, in everything but name and training, and it just wouldn't be right to treat people that way. Slaves feel pain. In simple reciprocity, masters feel guilt. And because, according to the society and the laws and the appearances and the regulations, there was no need for guilt, the masters of Fruyling's World had, like masters anywhere and any time, buried the guilt, hidden it even from themselves, forbidden its existence and forgotten to mention it to their thoughts. But the guilt remained, and the guilt demanded. Punishment was needed. "They're going to fight," Dr. Hannigan said. "When the Confederation attacks, they're going to fight back. It's senseless. Even if we won, the Confederation fleet could blockade us, prevent us getting a shipment out, bottle us up and starve us for good. But they don't need sense. They need motive, which is quite a different thing. They're going to fight, both because they need the punishment of a really good licking, and because fighting is one more way for them to deny their guilt." "It seems complex," Norma said. "Everything is complex," Dr. Hannigan said, "as soon as human beings engage in it. The action is simple enough. Warfare." "We've got to stop them," Dr. Hannigan went on as if she hadn't heard. "The actions serve two different, indeed two contradictory purposes. If you think that's something rare in the actions of mankind, you must be more naive than you have any right to be." "We've got to stop them," Norma said again. "Got to. They'll die. We'll all die." "There is nothing to do," Dr. Hannigan said. "We are outplayed. By the Confederation, by our own selves. We are outplayed. There are no moves left. There is nothing I can offer, nothing anyone can offer, quite as attractive as the double gift of punishment and denial." Shockingly, for the first time, the old woman sounded tired. Her voice was thin in the gray room. "Nothing we can do, Norma. You're dismissed. Go back to work." "But you can't just give up. You can show them there aren't any real reasons. Show them they're not being rational." "Oh, but they'll be rational," Dr. Hannigan said in the same still voice. "Wait for the rumors to start, Norma. Wait for them to begin telling each other that the Confederation is going to kill them all anyhow, take them back and hang them as war criminals." "That's ridiculous." "Perhaps. Then, rumors during a war are almost always ridiculous. That fact makes no difference at all. They'll be believed, because they have to be believed." Norma thought. "We can start counter-rumors." "Which would not be believed. They offer nothing, nothing that these people want." "Oh yes, people can be changed." Dr. Hannigan paused. "Given sufficient time and sufficient equipment, it is possible to make anyone into anything, anything at all. But to change these people, to make them act as we want, the time required is more than 10 years, Norma, and we haven't got 10 years." "We've got to try," Norma said earnestly. "What we have got," Dr. Hannigan said, "is more like 10 days. And there is nothing to do in 10 days. The people have spoken. Vox populi." The eyes closed. There was a silence. Norma waited, astonished, horrified. "Perhaps it is necessary," Dr. Hannigan's voice said. "Perhaps. We must wait. Ich kann nicht anders." "What?" Norma asked. "Martin Luther," Dr. Hannigan's voice said, remote and thin. "It means I can do nothing else." He wrote it as his justification for a course of action that was going to get him excommunicated, perhaps killed. But Dr. Hannigan said nothing, did nothing. The body sat behind its desk in the gray room. Norma stared, then turned and fled. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The mixture of feelings inside Cadnan was entirely new to him, and he couldn't control it very well. He found himself shaking without meaning to, and was unable to stop himself. There was relief, first of all, that it was all over, that he no longer had to worry about what Marvor might have planned, or whether Marver were going to involve him. There was fright, seeing anyone carry through such a foolhardy, almost impious idea in the teeth of the masters. And there was simple disappointment. The disappointment of a novice theologue who has seen his pet heretic slip the net and go free. For Cadnan had tried earnestly, night after night, to convert Marver to the new truths the elders had shown him. They were luminously obvious to Cadnan, and they set the world in beautiful order. But somehow he couldn't get through to Marver at all, couldn't express the ideas he had well enough or convincingly enough to let Marver see how beautiful and true all of them really were. For a time, in fact, he told himself with bitterness that Marver's escape had really been all his own fault. If he'd only had more talks with Marver, he thought cloudily, or if he'd only been able to speak more convincingly. But regret is part of a subjunctive vocabulary. At least one writer has noted that the subjunctive is the mark of civilization. This may be true. It seems true. In Cadnan's case, at any rate, it certainly was true. Uncivilized, he spent little time in subjunctive moods. All that he had done, all that Marver had done, was open to him, and he remembered it often, but once the bad first minutes were past, he remembered everything with less and less regret. The mixture, as it stood, was heady enough for Cadnan's untrained emotions. He had tried to talk to Marver about the truths, of course. Marver, though, had been obstinately indifferent. Nothing made any impression on his hardened, stubborn mind. And now he was gone. Dara had the news first. She came into their common room at the end of the day very excited, her hands still moving as if she were turning handles in the refinery even after the close of work. Cadnan, still feeling an attraction for her and perceiving now that something had disturbed her, stayed where he was squatting. Attraction for Dara, and help given to her, might lead to mating, and mating was against the rule. But Dara came to him.
"Do you know what happens with Marver?"
she said. Her voice, always quiet, was still as sweet to Cadnan as it had ever been.
"He is gone, and the masters do not know where."
The mixture of emotions began. Surprise and relief first, then regret and disappointment, then fear, all boiling and bubbling inside him like a witch's stew. He spoke without thinking.
He is gone to break the chain of obedience. He is gone to find others who think as he thinks.
"He is escaped,"
Dara said.
"It is the word the masters use when they speak of this."
"It happens before now,"
Cadnan told her.
"There are others whom he joins."
Dara shut her eye.
"It is true, but I know what happens when there is an escape. In the place where my work is, there is one from Great Bend Tree. She tells me of what happens."
Dara fell silent, and Cadnan watched her nervously. But he had no chance to speak. She began again, convulsively.
"When this other escapes, it is from a room of Great Bend Tree."
Cadnan nodded. He and Dara were of Bent Line Tree, and hence in a different room. The segregation, simple for the masters, was handy and unimportant, and so it was used. Cadnan thought it natural. Every tree had its own room.
"Do they find the one who escapes?"
he asked.
"They find him. The masters come in, and they punish the others from the room."
Precedent was clearly recognizable, even though it made no sense. Those who had not escaped surely had no reason to be punished, Cadnan thought. But what the masters had done to Great Bend Tree, they would do to Bent Line Tree. Everyone would be punished. With a shock, he realized that everyone included Dara. He heard himself speak.
"You must go."
Dara looked at him innocently.
"Go?"
she said.
"You must go as Marver has gone. The masters do not take you for punishment if you go."
"There is nothing for me to do,"
she said, and her eye closed.
"No, I wait for you, but only to tell you this. There is nothing I can do."
"Marver is gone,"
Cadnan said slowly.
You too can go. Maybe the masters do not find you. If you stay, you are punished. If you go, and they do not find you, there is no punishment for you.
It amazed him that she could not see so clear a point.
Then all can go,
she said.
All can escape punishment.
Cadnan grunted, thinking that over.
Where one goes, he said at last, one can go. Maybe many cannot go.
Her answer was swift.
And you? I stay here,
he said, trying to sound as decisive as possible. Dara turned away.
I do not listen to your words, she said flatly. I do not hear you or see you.
Cadnan hissed in anguish. She had to understand.
Shh! What do I say that is wrong? You must. You speak of my going alone, she said. But that is me, and no more. What of the others? Marver, Cadnan said after a second. He is to come and aid them. He tells me this. We join him and come back with him, away from here, to where he stays now. Then none of us are punished.
He paused.
It will be a great punishment. I know,
Dara said.
Yet one does not go alone.
Her voice was so low that Cadnan could barely hear it, but the words were like sharp stones, stabbing fear into his body. For the first time, he saw clearly exactly what she was driving at. And after a long pause, she spoke again.
Where one goes, two may go. Where Marver goes, two may follow. One to lead the other. One goes alone, Cadnan said, feeling himself tremble and trying to control it. You must go. It seemed a long time before she spoke again, and Cadnan held himself tightly until his muscles began to ache. We go together, she said at last. Two go where one has gone. Only so do I leave at all. It was an ultimatum, and Cadnan understood what was behind it. But an attraction between Dara and himself? He said, There is the rule of the tree. But it was like casting water on steel. If we leave here, Dara said, why think of a smaller rule? Cadnan tried to find words, but there were no words. She had won, and he knew it. He could not let Dara stay behind to draw a great punishment, possibly even to die, to be no more Dara. And there was no way of forcing her to go and escape that fate. No way except to go with her. We must wait until they sleep, Dara said in a sudden return to practicality. Then we go. Cadnan looked around at the huddled, vaguely stirring forms of his companions. Fear was joined by a sort of sickness he had never known before. He was a slave, and that was good. But once outside, where would he find work, or food, or a master? Where there was no master, Cadnan told himself, there was no slave. He was nothing, nameless, non-existent. But there was neither word nor action for him now. He tried once more to argue, but his words were parried with a calm tenacity that left no room for discussion. In the end, he was ready to do what he had to do. Had to do in order, simply, to save Dara. There was no other reason. He needed none. He had heard of the attraction of male for female, though some did not experience it until the true time of mating. He had not, until that moment, known how strong the attraction could be. The waiting, though it seemed like positive days, didn't take long. The others in the room fell asleep by habit, one by one, and soon Dara and Cadnan were the only ones left awake. Neither was tempted to sleep. Their own terror and their decision kept them very effectively alert. Cadnan said, If the masters see us? Dara turned on him a face that seemed completely calm. They do not see us, she said flatly. Now do not speak. They rose and silently went to the door. The door opened just as quietly and shut once again behind them. The corridor was filled with watching eyes.
Cadnan felt. But there were no masters in evidence. They stood for a second, waiting, and then Dara started down toward the big room at the end, her feet silent on the floor, and Cadnan followed her. No masters were visible. There should have been guards, but the guards might have been anywhere. One escape had hardly served to alert a lazy, uninterested group who performed their duties out of no more than habit. Wherever the guards were resting, they were not in the corridor. Everything went smoothly. It was smoother than Cadnan was willing to believe. Soon, though, they were actually in the great lobby of the building. It, too, was dark and empty. They stood dwarfed by the place, the gigantic doors that led to freedom no more than a few feet away. Cadnan kept telling himself that where Marver had gone, he too could go. But Marver had had a plan, and Cadnan had none. Yet they were safe, so far. So far. They walked toward the door now, a step at a time. Each step seemed to take an hour, a full day. Dara walked ahead, straight and tall. Cadnan caught up with her, and she put out her hand. There was no more than an instant of hesitation. He took the hand. That pledged them to each other until the time of mating. But what was one more law now? Another step, another. Cadnan, in the silence, was suddenly tempted to make a noise. Any sort of noise. But it seemed impossible to create sound. The quiet dimness wrapped him like a blanket. He took another step. Mating, he thought. If the chain of obedience was broken, would the trees refuse to obey in their turn? Puna had said so, and it was true. And if the trees refused to obey, there would be no mating. Yet Dara would be safe. That was the important thing. One thing at a time. Another step, and then at last, the door. Cadnan pushed at it, and it opened. And then there was sound. Plenty of sound. More sound than he could have imagined. Sound to fill the great lobby, to fill the entire building, with rocking, trembling agonies of noise. There was an alarm bell, to be exact, an alarm buzzer, combinations and solo cadenzas. The guards were, after all, no more than dressing. The automatic machinery never slept, and it responded beautifully and with enthusiasm. Cadnan and Dara ran crazily out into the darkness. The building fell behind them and the jungle was ahead. Still they ran, but Cadnan felt the ground, bumpy instead of smooth, and stumbled once, nearly falling. He saw Dara ahead of him. Getting up and beginning again was automatic. Panic beat at him. The noise grew and grew. His feet moved, his heart thudded, and then the lights went on. Automatic sweep searchlights were keyed in. The machinery continued to respond. Cadnan found himself suddenly struck blind. Ahead of him, Dara made a single, lonely, terrified sound that overrode all the alarms. Cadnan tried to shout,
"We must run! In the dark, the masters cannot see!"
But of course, by then it was too late to move. The masters were all around them. The escape was over. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Of course, there was Norma, Dodd told himself. There was Norma, to make everything worthwhile. Except that Norma needed something too, and he couldn't provide it. No one could provide it, not as long as no one was allowed off planet. And it was quite certain, Dodd told himself gloomily, that the restrictions that had been in force yesterday were going to look like freedom and carefree joy compared with the ones going into effect tomorrow or next week. If, of course, there was going to be a tomorrow. That, he thought, was always in doubt. He managed sometimes to find a sort of illusory peace in thinking of himself as dead, scattered into component atoms, finished, forever unconscious, no longer wanting anything, no longer seeing the blinking words in his mind. Somewhere in his brain, a small germ stirred redly against the prospect, but he tried to ignore it. That was no more than brute self-preservation, incapable of reasoning. That was no more than human nature. And human nature, he knew with terror, was about to be overthrown once more. It was only human, after all, to find the cheapest way to do necessary work. It was only human to want the profits high and the costs low. It was only human to look on other races as congenitally inferior, as less than man in any possible sense, as materials, in fact, to be used. That was certainly human. Centuries of bloody experience proved it. But the Confederation didn't want to recognize human nature. The Confederation didn't like slavery. The rumor he'd heard from Norma was barely rumor anymore. Instead, it had become the next thing to an officially announced fact. Everyone knew it, even if next to no one spoke of it. The Confederation was going to send ships. Had probably sent ships already. There was going to be a war. The very word war roused that red spark of self-preservation. It was harder, Dodd had found, to live with hope than to live without it. It was always possible to become resigned to a given state of affairs. But not if he kept thinking matters would improve. So he stamped on the spark, kept it down, ignored it. You had to accept things and go on from there. It was too bad Norma didn't know that. He'd tried to tell her, of course. They'd even been talking over in Building 1 on the very night of the near escape. He'd explained it all very clearly and lucidly, without passion. Since he had cut himself off from hope, he found he had very few passions of any kind left, and that made it easy. But she hadn't been convinced. "As long as there's a fighting chance to live, I want to live," she'd said. "As long as there's any chance at all. The same as you." "I know what I want," he told her grimly. "What?" she asked and smiled. "Do you like what you're doing? Do you like what I'm doing? What the whole arrangement is here?" He shrugged. "You know I don't." "Then get out of it," she said, still smiling. "All you have to do is stop living. Just like that, no more trouble." "Don't be silly." "It can be done," she went on flatly. "There are hundreds of ways." Then the smile again. "But you'd rather live, Johnny. You'd rather live even this way, being a slaver, than put an end to it and to yourself." He paused. "It's not the same thing." "No," she said. "This way, you'd have to do the killing yourself. When the ships come, you can let them do it for you. Just sit and wait for someone to kill you, like a cataleptic. But you won't, Johnny." "I will," he said. She shook her head, the smile remaining. Her voice was quiet and calm, but there was a feeling of strain in it. There was strain everywhere now. Everyone looked at the sky and saw nothing. Everyone listened for the sound of engines, and there were no engines to hear. "Catalepsy is a kind of death, Johnny, and you'll have to inflict that much on yourself. You won't do it." "You think I—" He stopped and swallowed. "You think I like living this way, don't you?" "I think you like living," Norma said. "I think we all do, no matter how rough it gets. No matter how it grates on the nerves, or the flesh, or the supersensitive conscience. And I know how you feel, Johnny. I do. She stopped very suddenly. He heard his voice say, "I love you." There was a silence. "Johnny," she said, and her hands reached out for him blindly. He saw, incredibly, tears like jewels at the corners of her eyes. "Johnny." It was at that moment that the alarm bell rang. It was heard only faintly in Building 1. But that didn't matter. Dodd knew the direction and the sound. He turned to go, for a second no more than a machine. Norma's voice said, "Escape?" He came back to her. The alarm tripped off. This time they must have tried it through the front door or a window. The last one must have tunneled through. He had to leave her. Instead, he stood silently for a second. She said nothing. There are spots the steel's never covered, he said. You can tunnel through if you're lucky. A pause. It's all right, Johnny, she said. Norma, it's all right. I understand. It's all right. Her voice. He hung onto it as he turned and walked away. Found the elevator. Started away from the room. The building where she was. Started off to do his duty. His duty as a slaver. The night was long. So long, it could have been the night before the end of the world. The universe drawing one last deep breath before blowing out the candles and returning at last to peace and darkness and silence. Dodd spent it posted as one of the guards around the 2 cells where the Alberts were penned. He had plenty of time to think. And in spite of Norma, in spite of everything, he was still sure of one thing. Because he was a slaver, because he acted still as a slaver and a master, hated by the Confederation, hated by the Alberts, hated by that small part of himself which had somehow stayed clean of the foulness of his work and his life, because of all that, it was going to be very easy to die. Public Opinion 4. Being an excerpt from a directive issued by the executive and his private counsel, elected and confirmed by the Confederation, and upheld by majority vote of the Senate. The directive preserved in Confederation archives and signed under date of May 21st in the year 210 of the Confederation. It is therefore directed that sufficient ships be fitted out with all modern armaments, said fitting to be in the best judgment of the competent and assigned authorities, and dispatched without delay toward the planet known as Fruyling's World, both to subdue any armed resistance to Confederation policy and to affirm the status of Fruyling's World as a protectorate of the Confederation, subject to Confederation policy and Confederation judgment. An act of this nature cannot be undertaken without grave thought and consideration. We affirm that such consideration has been given to this step. It is needless to have fear as to the outcome of this action. No isolated world can stand against not only the might but the moral judgment of the Confederation. Arms can be used only as a last resort, but times will come in the history of peoples when they must be so used, when no other argument is sufficient to force one party to cease and desist from immoral and unbearable practices. In accordance with the laws of the Confederation, no weapons shall be used which destroy planetary mass. In general, our efforts are directed towards as little bloodshed as possible. Our aim is to free the unfortunate native beings of Fruyling's World, and then to begin a campaign of re-education. The fate of the human beings who have enslaved these natives shall be left to the Confederation courts, which are competent to deal in such matters by statute of the year 47 of the Confederation. We pledge that we shall not interfere with such dealings by the courts. We may further reassure the peoples of the Confederation that no further special efforts on their part will be called for. This is not to be thought of as a war or even as a campaign, but merely as one isolated, regretted, but necessary blow at a system which cannot but be a shock to the mind of civilized man. That blow must be delivered, as we have been advised by our counselors. It shall be delivered. The ships, leaving as directed, will approach Fruyling's World, leaving the FTL embodiments and re-entering the world line within 10 days. Full reports will be available within 1 month. In giving this directive, we have been mindful of the future status of any alien beings on worlds yet to be discovered. We hereby determine, for ourselves and our successors, that nowhere within reach of the Confederation may slavery exist, under any circumstances. The heritage of freedom which we have protected, and which belongs to all peoples, must be shared by all peoples, everywhere, and to that end we direct our actions and our prayers. Given under date of May 21st, in the year 210 of the Confederation, to be distributed and published everywhere within the Confederation, under our hand and seal. Richard Germont, by grace of God, Executive of the Confederation, together with his Council in Judgment assembled, all members subscribing thereto. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The room had no windows. There was an air conditioning duct, but Cadnan did not know what such a thing was, nor would he have understood without lengthy and tiresome explanations. He didn't know he needed air to live. He knew only that the room was dark and that he was alone, boxed in, frightened. He guessed that somewhere, in another such room, Dara was waiting, just as frightened as he was, and that guess made him feel worse. Somehow, he told himself, he would have to escape. Somehow he would have to get to Dara and save her from the punishment, so that she did not feel pain. It was wrong for Dara to feel pain. But there was no way of escape. He had crept along the walls, pushing with his whole body, in hopes of some opening. But the walls were metal, and he could not push through metal. He could, in fact, do nothing at all except sit and wait for the punishment he knew was coming. He was sure now that it would be the great punishment, that he and Dara would be dead and no more. And perhaps for his disobedience he deserved death. But Dara could not die. He heard himself say her name, but his voice sounded strange and he barely recognized it. It seemed to be blotted up by the darkness, and after that, for a long time, he said nothing at all. He thought suddenly of old Gornum and of Puna. They had said there was an obedience in all things. The slaves obeyed, the masters obeyed, and the trees obeyed. And possibly the chain of obedience, if not already broken by Marvor's escape and what he and Dara had tried to do, extended also to the walls of his dark room. For a long time he considered what that might mean. If the walls obeyed, he might be able to tell them to go. They would move, and he could leave and find Dara. Since it would not be for himself, but for Dara, such a command might not count as an escape. The chain of obedience might work for him. This complicated chain of reasoning occupied him for an agonized time before he finally determined to put it to the test. But when he did, the walls did not move. The door, which he tried as soon as it occurred to him to do so, didn't move either. With the land of terror, he told himself that the chain of obedience had been broken. The thought was too terrible for him to contemplate for long, and he began to change it little by little in his mind. Perhaps, for instance, the chain was only broken for him and for Marvor. Perhaps it still worked as well as ever for all those who still obeyed the rules. That was better. It kept the world whole and sane and reasonable. But along with it came the picture of Gornum, watching small Cadnan sadly. Cadnan felt a weight press down on him, and grow, and grow. He tried the walls and the door again, almost mechanically. He felt his way around the room. There was nothing he could do. But that idea would not stay in his mind. There had to be something, and he had to find it. In a few seconds, he told himself, he would find it. He tried the walls again. He was beginning to shiver. In a few seconds, only a few seconds, he would find a way. And then the door opened, and he whirled and stared at it. The sudden light hurt his eye. but he closed it for no more than a second. As soon as he could, he opened it again, and stood, too unsure of himself to move, watching the master framed in the doorway. It was the one who was called Dodd. Dodd stared back for what seemed a long time. Cadnan said nothing, waiting and wondering. "It's all right," the master said at last. "You don't have to be afraid, Cadnan. I'm not going to hurt you." He looked sadly at the slave, but Cadnan ignored the look. There was no room in him for more guilt. "I am not afraid," he said. He thought of going past Dodd to find Dara, but perhaps Dodd had come to bring him to her. Perhaps Dodd knew where she was. He questioned the master with Dara's name. "The female?" Dodd asked. "She's all right. She's in another room, just like this one. A solitary room." Cadnan shook his head. "She must not stay there." "You don't have to worry," Dodd said. "Nobody's doing anything to her. Not right now, anyhow. Not right now." "She must escape," Cadnan said, and Dodd's sadness appeared to grow. He pushed at the air as if he were trying to move it all away. "She can't." His hands fell to his sides. "Neither can you, Cadnan. Look, there's a guard stationed right down the corridor, watching this door every second I'm here. There are electronic networks in the door itself, so that if you manage somehow to open it, there'll be an alarm." He paused and began again, more slowly. "If you go past me, or if you get the door open, the noise will start again. You won't get 15 feet. Cadnan understood some of the speech and ignored the rest. It wasn't important. Only one thing was important. She cannot die. Dodd shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said flatly. "There's nothing I can do." A silence fell, and after a time he broke it. "Cadnan, you've really messed things up. I know you're right. Anybody knows it. Slavery is... Well, look, whatever it is, the trouble is it's necessary, here and now. Without you, without your people, we couldn't last on this world. We need you, Cadnan, whether it's right or not, and that has to come first." Cadnan frowned. "I do not understand," he said. "Doesn't matter," Dodd told him. "I can understand how you feel. We've treated you pretty badly, I guess. Pretty badly." He looked away with what seemed nervousness. But there was nothing to see outside the door. Nothing but the corridor light that spilled in and framed him.
"No,"
Cadnan said earnestly, still puzzled.
"Masters are good. It is true. Masters are always good."
"You don't have to be afraid of me," Dodd said, still looking away. "Nothing I could do could hurt you, even if I wanted to hurt you. And I don't, Cadnan. You know I don't."
"I am not afraid," Cadnan said. "I speak the truth, no more. Masters are good. It is a great truth."
Dodd turned to face him. "But you tried to escape." Cadnan nodded.
"Dara cannot die,"
he said in a reasonable tone.
"She would not go without me."
"Die?" Dodd asked, and then, "Oh, I see. The other..." There was a long silence. Cadnan watched Dodd calmly. Dodd had turned again to stare out into the hallway, his hands nervously moving at his sides. Cadnan thought again of going past him, but then Dodd turned and spoke, his head low. "I've got to tell you," he said. "I came here, I don't know why, but maybe I just came to tell you what's happening." Cadnan nodded.
"Tell me,"
he said very calmly. Dodd said, and then stopped. He reached for the door, held it for a second without closing it, and then briefly shook his head. "You're going to die," he said in an even, almost inhuman tone. "You're both going to die for trying to escape. And the whole of your clan or family or whatever that is, they're going to die with you. All of them." It was coming out in a single rush. Dodd's eyes fluttered closed. "It's my fault. It's our fault. We did it. And the rush stopped. Cadnan waited for a second, but there was no more.
"Dara is not to die,"
he said. Dodd sighed heavily, his eyes still closed. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. "It's a silly thing to say, I'm sorry. I wish there was something I could do." He paused. "But there isn't. I wish—" "Never mind. It doesn't matter. But you understand, don't you? You understand?" Cadnan had room for only one thought, the most daring of his entire life. "You must get Dara away." "I can't," Dodd said, unmoving. Cadnan peered at him, half fearfully.
You are a master.
One did not give orders to masters or argue with them. But Dodd did not reach for punishment. "I can't," he said again. "If I help Dara, it's the jungle for me, or worse. And I can't live there. I need what's here. It's a matter of necessity. Understand?" His eyes opened, bright and blind. "It's a matter of necessity," he said. "It has to be that way. And that's all." Cadnan stared at him for a long second. He thought of Dara, thought of the punishment to come. The master had said there was nothing to do, but that thought was insupportable. There had to be something. There had to be a way. There was a way. Shouting, "Dara!" he found himself in the corridor, somehow having pushed past Dodd. He stood, turning, and saw another master with a punishment tube. Everything was still. There was no time for anything to move in. He never knew if the tube had done it, or if Dodd had hit him from behind. Very suddenly, he knew nothing at all, and the world was blank, black, and distant. If time passed, he knew nothing about it. When he woke again, he was alone again. He was back in the dark and solitary room. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The office was dim now, at evening, but the figure behind the desk was rigid and unchanging, and the voice as singular as ever. "Do what you will," Dr. Haenlingen said. "I have always viewed love as the final aberration. It is the trap which lies in wait for the unwary sane. But no aberration is important anymore." "I'm trying to help him," Norma began. "You can't help him, child," Dr. Haenlingen said. Her eyes were closed. She looked as if she were preparing at last for death. "You feel too closely for him. You can't see him clearly enough to know what help he needs." "But I've got to—" "Nothing is predicated on necessity but action," Dr. Haenlingen said. "Certainly not success." Norma went to the desk, leaned over it, looking down into the still blank face. "It's too soon to give up," she said tensely. "You're just backing down, and there's no need for that yet." "You think not?" The face was still. "There are lots of rumors, that's true," Norma said. "But even if the worst comes to the worst, we have time. They aren't here yet. We can prepare." "Of course," the voice said. "We can prepare, as I am doing. There is nothing else for us, not anymore. Idealism has taken over, and what we are and what we've done can go right down the drain. Norma, you're a bright girl. Too bright to sit around and do nothing. But you don't understand this. Maybe you will someday. Maybe I'll have a chance. But that's for later, not now." Norma almost reached forward to shake some sense into the old woman. But she was Dr. Haenlingen, after all. Norma's hand drew back again. "You can't just sit back and wait for them to come." "There is nothing else to do." The words were flat, echoless. "Besides," Norma said desperately, "they're only rumors." She never finished the sentence. The blast rocked the room, and the window thrummed, steadied, and then suddenly tinkled into pieces on the carpeted floor. Dr. Haenlingen had barely moved. The eyes, in dimness, were open now. "That, my dear," the old woman said, was your rumor. My... The blast was repeated. Ornaments on the desk rattled. A picture came off the far wall and thudded to the carpet. The air was filled with a fine dust, and far below, Norma could hear a noise, a babble of voices. "They're here!" she screamed. Dr. Hanlon sat very still, saying nothing. The eyes watched, but the voice made no comment. The hands were still, flat on the desk. Below, the voices continued, and then Dr. Hanlon spoke. "You'd better go," the calm voice said. "There will be others needing help, and you will be safer underground in any case." "But you..." Norma began. "I may be lucky," Dr. Hanlon said. "One of their bombs may actually kill me." Her mouth open in an unreasoning accession of horror, Norma turned and fled. The third blast rattled the corridor as she ran crazily along it. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dodd stayed on his post because he had to. As a matter of fact, he hardly thought of leaving, or of doing anything at all. Minutes passed, and he stood in the hallway quite alone. The other guard had spoken to him when Cadnan had been picked up and tossed back into solitary, but Dodd hadn't answered, and the guard had gone back to his own post. Dodd stood, hardly thinking, and waiting, though he could not have said what for. This is the end. He had hit Cadnan. In those few seconds, he had acted just as a good slaver was supposed to act, and that discovery shocked him. Even more than his response during the attempted escape, it showed him what he had become. He had thought the words he used had some meaning. Now he knew they had next to none. They were only catchphrases meant to make him feel a little better. He was a slaver. He had been trained as a slaver, and he would remain a slaver. What was it Norma had said? "You'd rather live?" It was true. It was all true. But there was, he told himself dimly, still, somewhere, hope. The Confederation would come. When they did, he would die. He would die at last. And death was good. Death was what he wanted. No matter what Norma had told him, death was what he wanted. He was still standing, those few thoughts expanding and filling his mind like water in a sponge, when the building, quite without warning, shook itself. He heard the guard at the end of the corridor shouting. The building shook again, underneath and around him, dancing for a second like a man having a fit. Then he caught the first sounds of the bombardment. "Norma!" He heard himself scream that one word over the sounds of blast and shout, and then he was out of the corridor somehow, insanely running across open ground. Behind him, the alarms attached to the front doors of Building 3 went off, but he hardly heard that slight addition to the uproar. God alone knew whether the elevators would be working. But they had to be. They had to stand up. After he found Building 1, he could hardly trust the basement levels, choked by panic-stricken personnel from everywhere. He had to get to an elevator and find Norma. He had to find Norma. Overhead, there was a flash and a dull roar. Dodd stared before him at a tangled, smoking mass of blackness. A second before, it had been a fringe of forest. Smoke coiled round toward him, and he turned and ran for the side of Building 3. There were other sounds behind him, screams, shouts. As he passed the building, the ground shook again, and there was a sudden rise in the chorus of screams. He smelled acrid smoke, but never thought of stopping. The building still stood gleaming in the bombardment flashes, and he went round the corner, behind it, and found himself facing the dark masses of 1 and 2, 500 feet away over open ground. As he watched, there was a flash too bright for his eyes. He blinked and turned away, gasping. When he could look again, a piece of Building 2 was gone, looking from 500 feet distance as if it had been bitten cleanly from the top, taking about 4 floors from the right side. taking the topmast, girders and all, simply gone. But that was Building 2, not Building 1. Norma was still safe. She had to be safe. He heaved in a breath of smoky air and ran. Behind him, around him, the bombardment continued. Public Opinion 5. Being an excerpt from Chapter 7 of A Fourth Grade Reader in Confederation History by Dr. A. Lindell Jones, with the assistance of Mary Beth Wilkinson, published in New York, USA, Earth, in September of the year 199 of the Confederation, and approved for use in the public schools by the Board of Education, United, of the USA, Earth, in January of the year 200 of the Confederation. The first explorers on Fruyling's World named the new planet after the heroic captain of their ship, and prepared long reports on the planet for the scientists back home in the Confederation. The reports mentioned large metallic deposits, and this rapidly became important news. The metallic deposits were badly needed by the Confederation for making many of the things which still are found in your homes. Such useful objects as cleaners, whirlostats, and such all require metal from Fruyling's World. Of course, there were not many explorers on the new planet, and it was a hard job for them to dig out the metal the Confederation needed. But the planet had natives on it already. The natives were called Alberts, and here is a picture of them. Aren't they funny looking? The Alberts were happy to help with the digging in exchange for some of the good things the explorers talked about, because they didn't have many good things. But the explorers built houses for them and gave them food and taught them English, and the Alberts dug in the ground and helped get the metal ready to ship back to the Confederation. The following list of review questions may be helpful to the instructor. 1. Why is Fruyling's World called by that name? After whom was it named? 2. What is so valuable about Fruyling's World? 3. Who helps the explorers dig up the metal? 4. Why do they help? End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For Cadnan, the time passed slowly. Consciousness came back, along with a thudding ache in the head and a growing hunger. But there were no leaves on the smooth metal of the floor, and the demands of his body had to be ignored. His mind began to drift. Once he heard a voice, but when he told himself that the voice was not real, it went away. He found his hands moving as if he were pushing the buttons of his job. He stopped them, and in a second they were moving again. Then the room itself began to shake. Cadnan had no doubts of his sanity. This was different from the imaginary voice. The room shook again, and he wondered whether this were some new sort of punishment. But it did not hurt him. The rumbling sound of the bombardment came to him only dimly, and for brief seconds. To Cadnan it sounded like a great machine, and he wondered about that too, but he could find no answers. The rumbling came again and sounded nearer. Cadnan thought of machines shaking his small room, perhaps making it hot as the machines made metal hot. If that happened, he knew he would die. He called, "Dara!" It was hard to hear his own voice. There was no answer, and he had expected none, but he had had to call. The rumbling came again. Surely, he told himself, this was a new punishment, and it was death. There was only one thing for him to do. He sat cross-legged on the smooth floor as the rumble and the other sounds continued, and in opposition to them he made his song, chanting in a loud and even voice. He had learned that a song was to be made when facing death. He had learned that in the birth huts, and he did not question it. The song was necessary, and his voice, carrying over the sounds that filtered through to him, was clear and strong. "I am Cadnan. I am Cadnan of Bentline Tree.
I work for the masters. I push buttons and the machine obeys me. I push buttons when the masters say to do it. My song is short. I am near the dead. I have broken the chain of obedience. I do not want to break this chain. I must break it. Dara says I go. If I do not go, then Dara does not go. Dara must go. I break the chain. For this I am near the dead, and the room shakes. It is my death and my song. I am Cadnan and Bentline Tree, and I work. After the song was over, he remained sitting, waiting for what had to come. The rumbling continued, and the room shook more strongly. For some seconds he waited, and then he was standing erect, because he could see. The door, sprung from its lock by the shaking of the building, had fallen a little open. As Cadnan watched, it opened a bit more, and he went and pushed at it. Under a very light shove, it swung fully open, and the corridor, lights flickering down its length, stood visible. As Cadnan peered out, the lights blinked off and then came on again. The rumbling was very loud now, but he saw no machines. He went into the corridor in a kind of curious daze. There were no masters anywhere, none to watch or hurt him. He called once more for Dara, but now he could not hear himself at all. The rumbling was only one of the sounds that battered at him dizzily. There were bells and buzzes, shrieks, and cascades of brutal grinding sounds, more powerful than could be made by any machine Cadnan could imagine. He started down the corridor. The masters had taken Dara in that direction, opposite to his own. Suddenly, one of his own kind stood before him, and he recognized the female, Hortat, through the dusty air. Hortat was staring at him with a frozen expression in her eye. "What is it?" she asked. "What happens?"
Cadnan, without brutality, brushed her aside.
"I do not know. The masters know. Wait and they tell you."
He did not consider whether the statement were true or false, or perhaps, under these new circumstances, entirely meaningless. It was a noise he had to make in order to get Hortat out of his way. She stood against the corridor wall as he passed, watching him. He went on past her, moving faster now, into the central room from which the corridors radiated. The lights went off again, and then came on. He peered round, but there were no masters. Besides, he thought, if the masters found him, the worst they could do would be to kill him, and that was unimportant now. He already had his song. In a corridor at the opposite side of the central room, he saw a knot of Alberts, among whom he recognized only Puna. The elder was speaking with some others, apparently trying to calm them. Cadnan pushed his way to Puna's side and heard the talk die down, while all stared at the audacious newcomer.
"I am looking for Dara,"
Cadnan said loudly, to be heard over the continuous noise from elsewhere. Puna said,
"I do not know Dara,"
and turned away. Another shouted,
"Where are the masters? Where is work?"
Cadnan shouted,
"Wait for the masters,"
and went on, pushing his way through the noise, through the babbling crowd of Alberts. There were no masters visible anywhere. That was a new thing, and a strange one. But too many new things were happening. Cadnan barely noticed one more. At the front of his mind now was only the thought of Dara. Behind that was a vague, nagging fear that he was the cause of all the rumbling and shaking of the building, and all else, by his breaking of the chain of obedience. Now, he told himself, the buildings even did not obey. Then he heard a voice say, "Cadnan," and all other thought fled. The voice was hers, Dara's. He saw her ahead and went to her quickly. She had not been hurt. That fact sent a wave of relief through him, a wave so strong that for a second he could barely stand. "The door opens," she said when he had reached her, in a small and frightened voice. "The masters are not here."
"They return,"
Cadnan said, but without complete assurance. In this barrage of novelty, who could make any statement certain. Dara nodded.
Then we must go, she said. If they are not here, then maybe they do not hear the noise when we open the door, and there is much noise already to hide it. Maybe they do not see us.
And if they do? Dara looked away.
I have my song, she said.
And I have mine. It was settled. As they headed toward the big front doors, others followed. But there was no use bothering about that. When Cadnan opened the door, in fact, the others fell back and remained, staring, until it had shut behind them. There was the great noise of bells and buzzers, but that had been going on, Cadnan realized, even before they had begun. Outside, the spotlight seemed weaker. There was smoke everywhere, and ahead the forest was a black and frightening mass. He looked at Dara, who showed her fear for one instant.
I am also afraid,
he told her, and was rewarded by a look of gratitude.
But we must go on.
He took her hand. They walked slowly into the smoke and the noise. As they reached the edge of the forest, the sound began to diminish very slowly, and ahead of them, through the haze and beyond the twisted trees, the sun began to rise. They walked for a long while, and by the time they had finally stopped, the noise was gone. There was a haze over everything, but through the haze a morning sun shone, and a heavy peace hung over the world. There were trees, but these were neither like bent line tree for mating nor for food. Perhaps, Cadnan thought, they were for building, but he did not know, and had no way to know until an elder showed him. And there were no elders anymore. There were neither elders nor masters. There was only Cadnan and Dara, and somewhere Marver and the group he had spoken of. Cadnan peered round, but he saw no one. There were small new sounds, and those were frightening, but they were so tiny, rustles, squeaks, no more, that Cadnan could not feel greatly frightened by them. The green-gray light that filtered through the trees and haze bathed both Alberts in a glow that enhanced their own bright skin color. They stood for a few seconds, listening, and then Dara turned.
I know these sounds,
she said.
I talked to others in our room, and some of these work outside. They tell me of these sounds and this place. It is called a jungle.
Cadnan made a guess.
The trees make the sound?
Small beings make it, Dara corrected him.
There are such small beings, not slaves and not masters. They have no speech, but they make sound.
Cadnan meditated on this new fact for a short time. Then Dara spoke again.
Where is Marver? The time of mating is near.
Cadnan saw her meaning. It was necessary to find bent line tree, or some like it, and advising elders, all before the time of mating. Yet he did not know how.
Maybe masters come,
he suggested hopefully,
and tell us what to do.
Dara shook her head.
No, the masters kill us. They do not lead us anymore. Only we lead ourselves.
Cadnan thought privately that such an idea was silly, almost too silly for words. How could a person lead himself? But he said nothing to Dara, not wanting to hurt her. Instead, he pretended helplessly to agree with her.
You are right. We lead ourselves now. But we must know where Marver stays.
That sounded more reasonable. Cadnan considered it for a minute. Wherever Marver was hiding, it had to be somewhere in the jungle. And so, in order to find him, they had only to walk through it. And so they set out, on a walk long enough to serve as an aboriginal odyssey for the planet. The night beasts, soft glowing circles of eyes and mouths which none of their race had ever seen before. The giant flesh-eating plants. The herd of bovine monsters which, confused, stampeded at them, shaking the ground with their tread and making the feathery trees shake as if there were a hurricane. All this might have made an epic had there been anyone to record it. But Cadnan expected no more and no less. The world was strange. Any piece of it was as strange as any other. Once they came across a grove of food trees and ate their fill, but they saved little to take with them, being unused to doing their own planning. So they went on, hungry, and in the midst of dangers scarcely recognized, sleeping at night however they could, traveling aimlessly by day. And after a time that measured about 3 days, they stopped in a small clearing and heard a voice.
Who is there?
Cadnan, frightened by the sudden noise, managed to say,
I am Cadnan, and there is one with me called Dara. We look for Marver.
The strange voice hesitated a second, but its words, when it did speak, were in a tone that was peaceful enough.
I know of Marver, and will take you to him. It is not far to where he stays.
End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After the first rush of battle, matters began to quiet a little. Against tremendous odds, and in a few brief hours, the armaments of Fruyling's World had managed to beat off the Confederation fleets, and these had withdrawn to reform and to prepare for a new phase of the engagement. In the far-off days before the Age of Confederation, war had perhaps been an affair of grinding, constant attack and defense. No one could say for sure. Many records were gone. Much had been destroyed. But now there was waiting, preparation, linked batteries of armaments, and calculators for prediction. And then the brief rush and flurry of battle, followed by the immense waiting once more. For Dodd, it was a time to breathe and to look around. He had enough work to do. The damage to Building 3 and the confusion among the Alberts had to be dealt with, and all knew time was short. Very few of the Alberts had actually escaped, and most of those, Dodd told himself bitterly, would die in their own jungles for lack of knowledge or preparation. Most, though, simply milled around, waiting for the masters, wondering and worrying. Norma was safe, of course. After a frantic search, Dodd had found her below ground in the basements of Building 1, along with most of the Psych Division. Without present duties forcing them to guard or maintain the Alberts, the Psych Division had holed up almost entire, in the steel corridors that echoed with the dull booms of the battle. He'd gasped out some statement of relief, and Norma had smiled at him. I knew you'd be safe, she said. I knew you had to be. And, of course, she was right. Even if what she said sounded cold, removed. He had to remember that she was under shock, too. The attack had come unexpectedly on them all. It didn't matter what she said. She was safe. He was glad of that. Of course he was, he thought. Of course he was. Even if the things she said, the cold-blooded way she looked at the world, sometimes bothered him. And a day later, when everyone was picking up the scattered pieces of the world and attempting somehow to rig a new defense, she'd said more. Not about herself, or about him. Tacitly, they knew all of that had to wait for a conclusion to the battle. But about the Alberts. Of course, they're not disloyal, she told him calmly. They don't even know what disloyalty means. We've seen to that. The masters are as much a part of their world as food, I suppose. You don't stage a rebellion against food, do you? Dodd frowned. But some of them have escaped. Wandered, you mean. Just wandered off. And, oh, I suppose a few have. Our methods aren't perfect, but they are pretty good, Johnny. Look at the number of Alberts who simply stayed around. We're making them slaves. No. She shook her head violently. Nobody can make a slave. All we've done is seize an opportunity. Think of our own history, Johnny. First the clan, or the band. some sort of extended family group. Then, when real leadership is needed, the slave and master relationship. Now wait a minute, Dodd said. Norma had been brainwashed into some silly set of slogans. It was his job to break them down. The clan can elect leaders. Sure it can, she said. But democracy is a civilized commodity, Johnny. In a primitive society, it's a luxury the society can't afford. What guarantees have you got that the clan will elect the best possible leader? Or that, having elected him, they'll follow him along the best paths? Self-interest, but again she cut him off. Self-interest is stupid, she said casually. A child needs to learn. Schooling is in the best interest of that child. Agreed? Yes, but did you ever hear of a child who liked school, Johnny? She asked. Did you ever hear of a child who went to school regularly, eagerly, without some sort of force being applied, physical, mental, or moral? No, Johnny, self-interest is short-sighted. Force is all that works. But he was sure she was wrong, but he couldn't see where. Who are we to play God for them? He said at last. They need somebody, Norma said, and we need them. Even. She seemed harder now, somehow more decided. Dodd saw that the one attack had changed a lot. In Norma, in everyone. Albin, for instance, wasn't involved with fun anymore. He had turned into a fanatical drill sergeant with a squad of Alberts under him, and it was even rumored that he slept in their quarters. And Norma, what had happened to her? After the fighting was over and they could talk again, could they relax and reach out for each other once again? She had become so hard. One new fear ran through the defenders. The Alberts who had escaped might return, some said, vowing vengeance against the masters. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Cadnan had learned much in a very short time. Everyone was hurried now, as the time of mating approached more and more quickly, and as the days sped by. Knowledge was thrown at Cadnan and at Dara in vast, indigestible lumps, and they were left to make what they could of it, while the others went about their normal assigned work. He learned about the invasion, for instance, or as much about it as Marver, the elders, and a few other late arrivals could piece together. Their explanations made surprisingly good sense, in the main, though none of them, not even Marver, could quite comprehend the notion of masters having masters above them. It seemed contrary to reason. Cadnan learned also the new trees in this new place which the elders had found. There were food trees nearby, and others whose leaves were meant for building, and there were also trees of mating, like his own bent line tree. No one could tell Cadnan where bent line tree itself might be, and so he became resigned to his first mating with a new tree, which the elders had called Great Root Tree. It was not truly right, he told himself, but there was nothing to do about it. The life in the jungle made Cadnan uncomfortable. He was nothing larger than himself, and he felt very small. When he had masters, he was a part of something great, of the chain of obedience. But here in the jungle, there was no chain. And would the trees obey when their time came? And each felt himself alone. It was not good to feel alone, Cadnan decided. Yet again, there was nothing he could do. It mattered for a time, and then it ceased to matter. The time of mating came closer and closer, and Cadnan felt his own needs grow with the hours. The sun rose and fell and rose again. Then the time came. It was dark. There were others near them, but they were alone. Cadnan knew Dara was standing near him in the darkness, though he saw nothing. He heard her breath coming slowly at first, and then a little faster. He did not hear his own, but that was no matter. There was a sound from a small night animal, but it did not come near. He stood with Dara near to Great Root Tree. If he put out his hand, he could touch it. But he kept his hand at his side. Touching the tree at that moment was wrong. There were the old rules, the true rules, and to think of them made him feel better. Dara said nothing. It was not necessary for her to speak. They knew each other, and the attraction was very strong. Cadnan had felt the attraction before, but until that moment he had not known how strong it was. And then it grew and grew. Still they did not move. Darkness covered both, and there was no more sound. The very feeling of the presence of others disappeared. There was nothing but Cadnan and Dara and Great Root Tree. It called to him, but not to him alone. He knew what he had to do. He felt the front of his body growing warm and then hot. He felt the first touch of the liquid. He touched Dara. Their fronts touched. That alone was more than Cadnan had ever imagined, yet it was not enough. Still, there was more he was called on to do. He didn't think about it or know of it until it was done. He moved against Dara as she against him. He was not himself. He was more and less. He was only the front of his body, and he was Great Root Tree. He was all trees, all worlds. When he stepped back, it was like dying. But he could not die, since there was more for him to do. He stood still, very close to Dara, and, remaining close, he went to the tree. It was not far, and both knew the path, but it seemed far. Cadnan could feel the mixed liquids on his front, his and Dara's. Great Root Tree seemed to call these liquids to itself, and himself and Dara with them. They walked to it. In the darkness they could not see it, but they knew the tree. They had spent time knowing it before that night. Cadnan reached out a slow hand and touched the back of the tree, almost as smooth as metal, with only minute irregularities throughout its surface. Once again a long time seemed to pass, but it was not long. Then he was against the tree while Dara stood behind, waiting. He pressed himself against the bark, and he felt himself becoming part of Great Root Tree, becoming the tree itself, and this lasted for all time and no time, and he was separated from it and saw Dara come to where he had pressed, and move delicately and then fiercely upon the bark. Then he saw nothing, but heard her breathing faster and faster, and all sound stopped. There was a long silence, and then her breathing began again, very slowly, very slowly. She returned to Cadnan and took his hand. It was finished. Soon the tree would bud with the results of the liquids rubbed on it. After that, there would be small ones, and Cadnan would be an elder. All of this was in the future, and it was very dim in Cadnan's mind, but everything was dim. He lay on the ground, and Dara lay near him, both very tired, too tired to think of anything, and he felt himself shaking for a time, and his breath hissed in and out until the shaking stopped. Dara, too, was quiet at last. The darkness had not changed. There was no sound and no motion. It was over. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When the Confederation forces reformed, they came on with a crash. Dodd had heard for months that Froyling's world would never stand up to a real assault. He had even thought he believed it. But the first attack had bolstered his gloomy confidence, and the results of the second came not only as a surprise, but as a naked shock. The Alberts, in spite of a few fearful masters, had been issued Belbis tubes, and fought valiantly with them. The batteries did everything expected of them, and the sky was lit with supernal flashes of blinding color throughout one hard-fought night. Dodd himself, carrying a huge Belbis beam, braced himself against the outer wall of Building 1 and played the beam like a hose on any evidence of Confederation ships up there in the lightning-lit sky. He felt only like a robot, doing an assigned and meaningless job, and it was only later that he realized he had been shivering all the time he had used the killing beam. As far as he could tell, he had hit nothing at all. The battle raged for 6 hours, and by its end Dodd was half deafened by the sound and half blinded by the sporadic rainbow flashes that meant a hit or a miss or a return blow lancing down from the ships to shake buildings and ground. At first he had thought of Norma, safe in the bunkers below Building 1. Then she had left his mind entirely, and there was only the battle. The beginning of all things and the end. Only the battle and the 4 constant words in his mind. Even when the others began to retreat, and Dodd heard the shouted orders, he never moved. His hands were frozen to the Belbis beam. His ears heard only battle, and his eyes saw only the shining results of his own firing. There was a familiar voice. Albin's. "Get out while you've got a chance. It's over." Another voice. "Better surrender than get killed." The howls of a squad of Alberts as a beam lanced over them, touching them only glancingly, not killing, but only subjecting them to an instant of punishment. And the howls ceased, swallowed up in the greater noise. A voice. "Johnny!" It meant nothing. Dodd no longer knew he had a name. He was only an extension of his beam, firing with hypnotized savagery into the limitless dark. "Johnny!" He heard his own voice answering. "Get back to the bunker. You'll be safe in the bunker. Leave me alone." His voice was strange to his ears, like an echo of the blasts themselves, rough and loud. Dawn was beginning to color the sky very slightly. That was good. In daylight he might be able to see the ships. He would fire the beam and see the ships die. That was good, though he hardly knew why. He knew only that it pleased him. He watched the dawn out of a corner of one eye. "Johnny, it's all over. We've lost. It's finished, Johnny. Come with me." Norma's voice. But Norma was in the bunker. Norma had caused the battle. She had made the slaves. Now she was safe while he fought. The thought flickered over his mind like a beam blast and sank into blackness. "Johnny, please. Johnny, come on now. Come on. You'll be safe. You don't want to die." No, of course he didn't. He fired the beam, aimed, fired again, aimed again. He could die when his enemies were dead. He could die when everyone who was trying to kill him was dead. Then he could die, or live. It made no difference. He fired again, aimed again, fired. "Johnny, please." The voice distracted him a little. No wonder he couldn't kill all the ships, with that voice distracting him. It went on and on. "Johnny, you don't have to die. You're not responsible. Johnny, you aren't a slaver. You just had a job to do. Killing isn't the answer, Johnny. Death isn't the answer." The voice went on and on, but he tried to ignore it. He had to keep firing. That was his job, and more than his job. It was his life. It was all of his life that he had left. Dr. Hanlingen had told her she was too close to see properly, and of course she was. Perhaps she knew that in the final seconds. Perhaps she never did. But that Dodd, who wanted to die and who considered death the only proper atonement for his life, could have displaced that wish onto the Confederation, onto his enemies, and so reached a precarious and temporary balance, never occurred to her. And if it had, perhaps she could have done nothing better. Time had run out. Time had run out. Johnny Dodd's enemies wanted him dead, and so he had to kill them, and so avoid killing himself, and so avoid recognizing how much he himself wanted to be dead. But the balance wasn't complete. There was still the guilt, still the terrible guilt that made it right for the Confederation to kill him. The guilt had to be displaced too. Norma did what she could, did what she thought right. "You don't have to die," she told him. "You're not responsible." That was what he heard, and it was enough. He hadn't made the Alberts into slaves. He hadn't made the Alberts into slaves, but he knew who had. Long before, it had all been carefully explained to him. All of the tricks that had been used. Of course, Dodd thought. Of course he wasn't responsible. He felt an enormous peace descend on him like a cloak as he turned with the beam in his hand and smiled at Norma. She began tentatively to return his smile. The beam cut her down where she stood and left a swath of jungle behind her, black and smoking. Dodd, his job completed, dropped the beam. For one instant, 4 words lit up in his mind, and then everything went out into blankness and peace. The body remained, the body moved, the body lived for a time. But after those 4 words, blinding and bright and then swallowed up, Johnny Dodd was gone. He had found what he needed. This is the end. Public Opinion 6. From A Cultural Record of Froiling's World. Personal Histories of the Natives, called Alberts. As dictated and preserved on tape by Historical Commission HN 3-40-9. Subject called Cadnan.
Dara is dead in the returning. When new masters come to us and say the fighting is over, it is an accident which kills her. A stumble, they say, against a plant which is dangerous to animal life and to our kind. The accident is over and Dara is dead. And we return. I find Marver after the fighting, once only, and I asked him what it is that is so important about this fighting. The Confederation, the masters we now have, are only masters like the ones we know. Marver looks at me with a look as if he too is a master. Freedom is that important, he says. Freedom is the most important thing. I know that Marver is not right, because I know the most important thing. It is the dead. For me, Dara is most important, and I remember Puna, who is dead in the fighting. The rest does not matter. I say this now, knowing that the talk machine hears me, and that the Confederation hears me. I say, can freedom make me feel happy? Marver looks more like a master. Freedom is good, he says. And yet Dara is dead, I say, and others are dead. How do I feel happy when I know this? In freedom, Marver tells us, Dara would be safe, and the others. Yet it is freedom that kills them, I say. Marver says, not freedom, but the war. The fight against our masters here, the old masters, to make them give us freedom. I say, do not our old masters have freedom? They do, Marver says, now. This puzzles me. I say, but they have freedom at all times. They have what they want, and if freedom is a good, and they want it, then they have it. Marver says, it is true. They have freedom for themselves. Yet these other masters tell them what to do, I say, and fight them to make them do it. This is not the freedom you tell of. Marver says, there is a difference. I do not see this difference, and he cannot tell it to me, though he tries hard. But I think maybe the new masters can tell me what it is. Marver is going to what they call a school, and I also go. This is a place where masters tell things, and we must remember them. Remembering is not hard, but we must think also, and do work. It is not enough to ask a question and find an answer. It is necessary to find our own answers. A master asks us to count, and then to do things with the numbers we use in our counting. This is called arithmetic. We must do things with the numbers every day, and if we do not, the masters are not happy with us. This arithmetic is hard. It is all new. Yet, if I do it right, I do not find more food, or a better place, or anything I want. I do not see what is the use of this arithmetic. But the use does not matter. The master tells me a use. He says arithmetic and all the things in the school raise the cultural level. I do not know what a cultural level is, or if it is good to be raised. The masters do not care whether I know this. They make me do what they want me to do. And it is not simple like pushing buttons and watching a machine. It is not simple like all the things I do since I am small Cadnan. It is hard, very hard, and all the time it is more hard. Every day there is a school. Every day there is hard work. Marver says that freedom means doing for yourself what you want and deciding right and wrong. I say freedom is bad because the masters know right and wrong and we do not. Others say with me, there are some who know the old truths and think it is better when we too can understand right and wrong. But the masters say what we have is freedom. I say it is not so. The masters tell us what to do. They tell us to do arithmetic, to do all other school things, and we do not do for ourselves what we want. We do not do anything for ourselves, but always the masters tell us. This is the same as before the fighting. It is always the same. A master is a master. But the old masters were the best. I remember the old masters and the old work, and I want this time to come again. I want the old work, which is easy, and not this new work, which is hard. I want the old slavery, where we know right and wrong, and not the new slavery, where only the masters know, and they say they cannot tell us. If I am free, if I can decide for myself what it is that I want, then this is what I decide. I want the old masters back again. I, Cadnan, say this.
Public Opinion 7. From the speech of Dr. Anna Hanligen before the High Court, Earth, of the Confederation, preparatory to the passing of sentence. The attorneys for the Confederation government have called our position cynical, and my own attorneys have attempted, without success, to refute this charge. As head of the Psychological Division on Freiling's World, previous to the unjustified intervention of Confederation force in the affairs of that world, I feel it incumbent on me to define a position which even our own advocates do not seem to understand. I bear a good deal of the responsibility for conditions on Freiling's World, and I have not shirked that responsibility. I found the natives of that world in a condition of slavery due to the work of my predecessors. I maintained them in that slavery and made no move whatever to free them or to mitigate their status. This is, in truth, a cynical position. I do not believe, and I have never believed, that freedom is necessarily a good for all people at all times. Like any other quality, it can be used for good or for ill. In the contact between any barbarian people and any civilized people, some species of slavery is necessary. The barbarian does not know that he is a barbarian, and the only way to convey to him the fact that he stands at the bottom of a long ladder, a ladder so long that we have by no means reached its end, and have perhaps not yet seen its midpoint, is to force him to make contact with elements of civilization, and to utilize continuous force to keep this contact alive and viable. The alien, the barbarian, will not of himself continue contact in any meaningful manner. The gap is too great between his life and that of the civilized person, and a disparity so great becomes simply invisible. Under conditions of equality, the civilized person must degenerate to barbarian status. His mind can comprehend the barbarian, and he can move in that direction. The barbarian, incapable of comprehension of the civilized world, cannot move toward that which he cannot see. In order to bring him into motion, Slavery and subjection appear necessities. There has been no civilization of which we have record which has not passed through a period of subjection to another, more forceful civilization. The Greeks, the Romans, the Jews, all the great civilizations of which there is available record have passed through a period of slavery. Nor is this accidental. Some force must be applied to begin the motion towards civilization. That force, disguise it how you will, is slavery. It is clearly the attempt to make another person do what he would not do, does not wish to do, and sees no personal profit in doing, under threat of punishment. It is subjection. That subjection is all we mean by slavery. And slavery is a necessity. Perhaps we were wrong. Perhaps the slavery which was dictated to us by the conditions which prevailed upon Fruyling's World was not the best sort available. But freedom is not, in any case, the answer. A man may die as the result of too much oxygen. A culture, likewise, may die of too much freedom. I have no fear of the sentence of this court. My death is unimportant, and I do not fear it. I might fear that my work might be left undone, were I not certain that, under whatever name, the Confederation will find it necessary to maintain slavery on Fruyling's World. Of this I am quite sure. From the report of Genmo Darig Farnung, commanding Confederation Expeditionary Force, 3rd Sector, from Base of Occupation, Fruyling's World, NC 34157 4954. In the 3 planetary months, approximately 92 solar days, since occupation of this world, no serious incidents have been reported. The previous rulers of this world have been transshipped to Earth for disposal there by Confederation governmental process. With the introduction of fully automated machinery, the world's primary resources are being utilized for the good of the Confederation without the introduction of any form of slavery or forced labor whatever. Regarding education and aid as involving the native population, the initial shipments of teachers, investigators, and experts in xenopsychology have enabled the occupation force to begin a full educational program for the benefit of the natives. This program has been accepted by the natives without delay and without any untoward incidents, and reports to the contrary are assumed to have been initiated by disaffected personnel. The program of education in a democratic and workable form of government for these natives is, and must remain, one of the shining examples of the liberative effects of Confederation doctrine and government, and should provide a valuable precedent in future cases. Reports that the profits of the major business of this world since the introduction of automated machinery and experts for the repair and upkeep thereof have decreased to the vanishing point should not be taken as serious. This is assumed to be merely a temporary hardship due to the transfer workload from the natives to the automated structure. Since the only alternative is the placement of the workload on enslaved natives of this world, the temporary rise in taxes due to the loss of essential product profit should be taken as a needed and welcome sacrifice in the name of liberty by the peoples of the Confederation. A list of further urgent materials, together with a list of specialties now urgently required in order to maintain full production here, and a revised schedule of budgetary requirements to include these additional requisitions, is hereby appended. End of Chapter 22. Recording by Nick Bulka. End of Slave Planet by Laurence M. Janifer.